Good evening, everybody. It's amazing to see so many of you here. Welcome. Um, just by way of housekeeping, in the event of a fire, the escape doors are there. In the event of needing a toilet break, that's the same direction. And just to let you know, we're filming this for YouTube, so I hope you're all happy with that. I'd just like to thank Deputy Carolyn Labby for saying a few words. As Jersey architects, we appreciate our special environment and island context, as I hope you can see from these slides behind you. Deputy Labby was the force behind the Jersey Identity Paper, which is a wonderful document and well worth reading. It talks about people feeling that Jersey is losing some of its unique identity and how our island's distinctiveness is often created by the simplest things like farm buildings, lavoirs, piers and slipways. Celebrating a local identity is a vital brief for local architects, and why I think Isabelle's talk is so relevant. Welcome, Deputy.
So good evening, everyone, and it's a privilege to have been asked here today to speak to you about our horizon and our heritage, the evolving architectural vernacular of Jersey and how it reflects our island identity. I would like to begin by introducing the Island Identity Project, an initiative I lead as Minister for International Development. The project asks two simple but important questions. What makes Jersey special, and why does that matter? The project was born out of a desire to better understand, promote and celebrate Jersey's unique character, from our Norman roots and the founding of our constitutional autonomy to the multicultural community and global connections we all enjoy today. The project aims to foster a stronger sense of belonging and pride among islanders, while also protecting a coherent and positive image of Jersey internationally. The Island Identity Project encourages us to think deeply about our shared values, our cultural expressions, and the physical spaces that shape our daily lives. Amongst its goals is the commitment to conserve expressions of Jersey's distinctive character and heritage. And nowhere is this balance between tradition and innovation more visible than in our built environment. The environment section of the Island Identity Movement highlights the built environment as a vital cultural, social and economic resource central to our identity and well-being. It is a tangible reflection of Jersey's character, capable of generating a strong sense of place and pride. Importantly, the report reminds us that our physical identity is not confined to notable heritage buildings, but is also derived from the commonplace structures and places that provide the backdrop to our daily lives. As Mike alluded to, our homes, shops, office, farm buildings, street furniture, hedgerows, lavoirs, postboxes, piers, slipways, gardens, and so on. These everyday elements are just as vital in shaping our sense of place and belonging. Yet the report also acknowledges a troubling reality. Much of what makes Jersey's public realm special has been lost through the destruction of significant buildings and the rise of developments that lack harmony with our island's character. It calls for stronger but consistent planning policies, the introduction of conservation areas, and the revival of historic buildings and grant schemes and more systematic guidance on development viability. It urges a more empirical approach to balancing heritage with progress. Across the island, we are witnessing a quiet revolution in design and the blending of historical references with contemporary needs. This architectural movement is not about nostalgia, it's about reinterpreting Jersey and Jersey's identity through materials, form, and function. Developments such as Heritage Farm on La Grande Route de Saint-Clement, Andean's La Grande Douai, and the Ann Street Brewery regeneration are prime examples. These projects incorporate local stone, pitch roofs, and coastal tones, while integrating sustainable features such as EV chargers, green spaces, and pedestrian-friendly layouts. Architecture, as you will know, I sense I'm say something that is obvious. Architecture is more than shelter. It's a statement of values. It tells us who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. In Jersey, our buildings are beginning to speak a new language, one that honours our past while embracing our future. This is especially important as we welcome new residents, respond to climate challenges, and redefine our place in a globalised world. The Island Identity Project reminds us that the identity is not static. It evolves, and our architecture must evolve with it, not by abandoning tradition, but by reimagining it. Let us continue to shape Jersey's landscape with care, creativity, and pride. Let our buildings reflect the richness of our island identity in every stone, every street, and every skyline. Thank you. Bless you. I will just say, I have laxed some of these. This is the consultation document that went with the Island Identity Project, and some cards on a little table outside with the QR code that will take you directly to the website. And there's a 200-pager document, which has got some quite interesting elements about the environment in it, and also the easier to read document, What Does Jersey Mean to You? So I've just left them outside. Okay.
Thank you, Deputy. And if you could put a good word in for local architects in government procurement, that would be really appreciated. Isabelle Priest is an award-winning architectural journalist and writer, currently working as managing editor of the RIBA Journal. She's also the author of a new book called New Scottish Houses, which she will talk about this evening. Isabelle, welcome to Jersey.
My name is Isabelle Priest, and thank you for coming this evening. I'm here to talk about my new book, which I have a copy of just here, about new Scottish houses. And the tagline is Contemporary Architecture and Living in the Landscape. So it was published by RIBA Publishing, who I also work for and have worked for 10 years. And it was published in July of this year. And I've spent a good few years working on it, but in some ways it's been about a decade in the making, and for the architects in the book, much longer. So just to introduce me briefly, so I've been working in architectural journalism and writing for about 15 years. So I currently work as managing editor at the RIBA Journal, and this book is my first book, and it's a side project in relation to my main work, really. Quite a big one, though. So I've previously worked at other publications like the Architects Journal, Architecture Today, A10 magazine, which is a sort of a European magazine that sadly no longer exists, and then also at the Modern House, which I hope you have all heard of, a sort of a estate agency that specialises in contemporary homes and has really kind of brought those to the public's attention, I'd say. And I've written freelance for other publications and architectural practices. And so I trained in architecture and I have a master's in architectural history. So in terms of this evening, I'm going to talk about the book, a bit about how and why it came about, a bit about the history and sort of driving forces behind this trend for architect-designed contemporary homes in the landscape, and what features and aspects draw these projects together as kind of a collective body of work, and how they balance actually many of the items just spoken about: landscape, culture, and contemporary needs. So there are sort of 4 key areas that I identify, and we'll go through those via case studies, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. So in terms of what is in the book, so the book showcases private houses across rural and remote Scotland, and it brings them together as a body of work really for the first time. So there are 24 in-depth case studies, and there are also 5 interviews with architectural practices about their work and sort of how they came about, and what their motivations are, and how they go about their work. So the book is based around geography, and it's kind of sort of on the sort of, it's sort of arranged around the compass, really, north, south, east, and west, etc. But there's also islands and central regions. And the focus has been, I mean, it's text as well, I'm a writer, but also on original photography and drawings, which, I mean, the book is for architects, but it's also for homeowners and the public, and people commissioning buildings. And so the idea is really that each case study explains the building in full, so it has plans, sections, and all that kind of thing too, which makes it much harder to produce, but more worthwhile. And there are 18 different practices in the book. So in this next slide, hopefully it will work, you can have a kind of quick glimpse of the book and see sort of big images, drawings, lots of information that help people understand the projects in depth. And I think what's also quite crucial is that there are 24 projects in the book, but there could easily have been twice that number, and it would have maintained the quality and breadth of the types of projects that there are taking place in rural and remote Scotland. So most of the projects are from the last 5 to 7 years, I'd say. The oldest is from 2013. So there's an emphasis, partly because I'm a journalist, on the new and to see what's really happening now. And we've also included, where possible, construction costs, which is also very difficult to get out of architects and homeowners. So about 50% of them have those in the case studies. And of course, you've got to take into account, when looking at them, when they were built, because as we all know, the cost of construction has changed considerably in the last 5 years, really. So the book is about these private contemporary homes in rural and remote Scotland. And it's worth saying that a number of, well, a handful, actually, that's the word I use there, and it's right, architectural practices have been working on these types of homes since about the year 2000. And in the past 5 to 10 years, the number of projects, the number of practices, the types of locations, sort of geographical locations, and the variety of the architecture being built has really proliferated and grown, and it's become definitely a movement, really. And it's only because of that there has been recently enough diversity within the architecture and that community to create a book. Before, it would have relied heavily on these handful of practices, and it would have been very Highlands focused and islands focused as well. So this work is about bringing it together really for the first time in a book, and you could call it a kind of new Scottish vernacular that's connected to the landscape. And I guess what's particularly interesting is that it's developing now, and it's very new, and the architects that are working in this area are very actively helping each other in sort of bettering their work, essentially, and it is a real community. And what's also what makes it relevant now is that since the pandemic, there has been an additional search for retreat, for outdoor living and outdoor lifestyles, for solitude, and many people have found that in the Scottish landscape. And so there have been more commissions for these types of projects as a result. So just to kind of give you a quick demo of the variety of architecture that we're talking about, yet there are themes that run through all of these projects. So a couple of them will go in, now 4 of them I think will go into in greater detail, but on the top left you've got Tin House, that's by Rural Design, Torrin by Dulcas in the other corner, and then Island Retreat by McGinley Bell, Cuddymoss, which you may have seen. It won the Doolan Prize a few years ago by Anne Nisbet, 100 Acre Wood in that bottom corner there, and that's designed by Denizen Works. And then this is two houses and an office and 2 houses, and that's by Loder Monteith. So yeah, as you can see, these are in the landscape, but they're very different from each other. So as I said before, you can kind of call it a new vernacular, and it traces its origins to the turn of the millennium, and really it begins on an island, the Isle of Skye. So there are many factors at this point that make it happen, and at this time. And the first of these is infrastructure, and this particular bridge. So this is the first bridge that replaces one of the ferry connections from the mainland to Skye, and it opened in 1995. And this made access on and off the island easier. It made living there easier. It made all sorts of things easier and more reliable without having to catch a ferry that may or may not run. The second point is technology, which was familiar probably everywhere, the arrival of broadband, and it meant that you could live and work on the island in a wide range of professions and live away from your place of work potentially with remote working. And then we've got a kind of political context, which this is sort of the end of the 90s, and there's a burgeoning sense of a Scottish identity, a re-emerging Scottish identity with independence also. So the referendum on devolution happened in 1997, and power was transferred from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament in 1999. And with that comes a sort of a cultural renaissance, essentially, a search for a more authentically Scottish local architecture. And then we've also got the sort of growing outdoor culture that we've touched upon of cycling, hiking, kayaking, and all those other activities. So I guess one of the biggest lessons is how quickly an architecture culture can change. This is like 25 years old, but it is changing the profile of Scottish architecture. It is changing what Scottish architecture is known for, but it's been very fast. And within this context emerge a handful of young architects, and it's very much grassroots led. It's not politically led. It is a few people with some good ideas and some motivation. So they're ambitious and they want to make stuff happen. And so at an architectural level, rather than sort of a wider context level, they are frustrated by the rural homes that are being built in Scotland at this time. So back then, there was a trend for Scandinavian kit houses, which some of my family even did as well. So I understand that well. They built a kind of kit house in the 90s in rural Scotland. And these architects didn't think that those kit houses were particularly relevant to the Scottish context, and they wanted to break with those designs. However, they were timber framed, but in terms of their designs, they were more or less based on a sort of suburban house model. You enter, there's a hallway, you've got small rooms coming off on different sides. They're 2 stories, they've got a pitched roof. But they didn't feel like that they were really representative of what Scottish rural homes should be. So they wanted to give a kind of contextual alternative to these types of houses. At the time, there was also a financial incentive that wasn't necessarily used, like they decided to use it, but it was called the Rural Home Ownership Grant, and it supported people to build a property in a rural area if they kept within a £40,000 budget and a footprint of 70 square metres. So it was designed to encourage people to continue to live in the areas that they had grown up or live in remote areas and counter depopulation. And so the first of these practices that come out is Dulcas, which was set up by these 2 young brothers, and they were super young. One had just left architecture school and one was still at architecture school. And so it's Neil and Alistair Stephen, and they wanted to reconnect with their Highland culture, like family culture. So their grandmother lived on Skye and they wanted to learn Gaelic and build a house there. And this is in 1996. So what they did was they were very much about reconnecting with this culture. So they took the traditional Highland longhouse or black house as a sort of model. So these are single-story buildings that are low-lying. They have open floor plans and they almost disappear into the landscape. They're also made of local materials. I mean, some of them are hundreds of years old, like thatch and stone, and they are almost intrinsically adapted to the climate and to geographical conditions. So this is the home that Alistair built for himself. It's called Site of the Stackyard, and it has many of these attributes in terms of its physical form, but what they did is combined it with the Scandinavian kit homes, which had been so appealing. And the reason for that was because they're made of timber, they're cheap and easy to construct. Whereas obviously the previous types of the traditional longhouse with stone, thatch, etc., is just not feasible, certainly for that £40,000 budget, which he made use of. And this is the house that really kicked off their business. So the other the other practice that emerged is rural design, and they came from a completely different background. So it was set up by Alan Dixon and Jill Smith, who are 2 architects at the time. They're still architects, but not working in Glasgow anymore. They came from they were working in commercial firms in Glasgow, and essentially they had been on holiday on Skye and they liked it. They were attracted by its wildness, rawness, and its exposed position on the edge of the Atlantic. So not dissimilar to perhaps some of the conditions that you might find in Jersey, even though we're talking about sort of 1,100 kilometres further north. And they decided to build a house for themselves at the very western peninsula. And it's called Wooden House, and this is it. And they completed it in 2003. And so rather than being about a renaissance of Highland culture, their motivation was an interrogation of how they wanted to live as a couple and then young family. And they really wanted to change their lives, essentially. So this is Wooden House. And there are a few key design considerations. So their work is inspired by the work of Brian Mackay Lyons, who's from Nova Scotia, nothing local about that, rather than specifically Scottish examples. And what they were interested in was a super flexible space, what they call a plastic space, that engaged with the views, had this central living space. There are no corridors or hallways, and there wasn't even a door on the bathroom for many years, I think. And so they took up the same idea as Dulcas about building with timber, and they did so also for speed, but also about honesty and integrity. And you can see inside the images that that they exposed it to. However, at this time, the planners stipulated that that it must be 1.5 stories and that it must be painted white. And that was to resemble the traditional White House on Skye, which is another sort of traditional type of architecture on the island that's not as old as the Black Houses, and some argue has more English connotations. And they wanted these things because in terms of the white paint and the 1.5 stories, because they wanted to disguise that it was made of timber. And this was something that many of the other architects designing homes at the beginning of this kind of trend for rural contemporary homes in the landscape encountered too, that they 20 years or so ago as well. So WT architecture, for example, was also asked by planners to paint their projects white and make sure it didn't look like it was built of timber. And I think these are sort of maybe common sort of themes that architects might encounter when they're trying to do something new. And so what's interesting about it is that, say, Dulcas wanted to go back to an actual sort of older traditional architecture, but somehow that wasn't quite palatable then. So while these initiatives began on Skye, the projects in this book are spread across Scotland, and so there are 14 main principal homes, 2 farmhouses, 7 holiday homes or second homes, and 3 holiday lets in the book. And what links them is a desire to be deeply contextual. So they respond in unique ways to the environments in which they're located. So they draw on geology, climate, heritage, building conditions, and a sense of identity. And so, in my opinion, what brings the projects together in the book, as not just in the book, but also as a body of work across this particular practice, are these four things. So landscape, culture, construction, and sustainability. And so for each of these areas, I'll go into them in more depth with a couple of case studies. So if we're just looking at the first one, landscape. So what unites the clients is a desire to be embedded within the natural landscape. And there are various ways in which the architects that design these homes do this, and they are either trying to be made from it, or by blending into the colours and the textures of the landscape. So just as a few kind of main moves, they might draw on the natural geometries and geology. So they might be drawn to the forms of the landscape. So for example, Lockside House, which I'll show you later, which was designed by Haysom Ward Miller and won the Reba House of the Year in 2018. It has pitched roofs, and the positioning of these pitched roofs relate to the mountains on the other side of the loch from the site. Then Isaac Arundel's project on Harris, which is on the cover of the book, that building uses local materials and so it uses stone, and it's designed to weave between existing boulders on the site. So it has a very faceted floor plan. So another way is how there isn't really such a thing as a formal domesticated garden in these projects. The landscape tends to run straight up to the house. And so the houses also tend to be quite modest in floor area. So if we look at this particular project, which is called Seangal, this is in South Lanarkshire, and it was designed by Loder Monteith and completed in 2021. So this has very distinctive red cladding, and and in terms of relating to the landscape, this is a colour that is actually very frequently found in the rolling hills around this particular site, in the buildings around the site. And so it was also colour matched to an existing tin barn next door. So that's one of the ways here that this particular practice wanted to connect with its sort of landscape heritage. In that way, it was also the kind of built landscape. And so in another way, it is also the sort of procession of pitched roofs recalls the rolling hills around the site. So when you go there, you are met with sort of very long roads that are really up and down, and they have that kind of feel of that sort of movement and in that roof. The project also reuses the stone that was on the site before. So the house is for a young family that has come back to this particular area, but whose wider family has farmed the land for generations. And it's in a working agricultural landscape, but there were many buildings on the site already in various states of disrepair, and they were sort of barns and storerooms and sort of animal shelters. And this replaces those, but readapts and reuses the materials that were found on the site. So the stone is from those existing buildings. It was sent away and reworked and redressed and came back and forms this kind of first ground floor level. And then inside, inside at the top, you can see the brickwork floor laid in a herringbone pattern. They are also the bricks from the existing buildings that had been on the site that they, very carefully, the owner scrubbed up and has repurposed and has been relaid as this beautiful floor. So in terms of landscape, in another sense, this is Torrin, which I showed you earlier. So this is by Julkas, and it was completed last year. It is pretty modest in size, as I said, most of them are, and it's a holiday home for a couple. And this is on the Isle of Skye. So the Cullen Hills are behind, right behind, and it faces the loch. And although this looks like it's sort of in the open wilderness, it's actually a part of a sort of small community of houses. And in terms of how it is embedded into the landscape, it uses quite a few different techniques actually. So it is set about one floor level lower than the rest of the village. So kind of sunken into the slope down to the water, which means that the surrounding homes still have views right over the top. It has this like fragmented massing of 4 interlocking volumes, cubic volumes, which helps to reduce its overall scale and sense of volume. It's also gable on, which means this is the shortest elevation. It's the front elevation, but it's the shortest one, and the building sort of stretches backwards, projecting towards the loch. Then it's also clad in Scottish larch, which has weathered to this beautiful silver, and this is a kind of colour that they find in the mountains behind and the rock faces behind. The rain's green cladding also continues onto the roof, which is fairly unusual because it is seen as the 4th elevation, if you like. It is visible from the houses behind, so they wanted it to look like the other elevations. It also sits on steel stilts, which you can't quite see here, but the landscape is almost immediately falling away underneath it from this very corner. So the grasslands that are below literally pass underneath the landscape. It comes up to and under the building, so it tries to sit lightly in its setting. You can also see right through the building from the entrance, which is designed to provide minimal obstruction. So these are the sort of these are more images of it, and some of the key parts about it. Internally, the building is all about being in the landscape, as you can see by almost replacing walls for windows, and about framing key views. So it's also minimal interior that is designed to place an emphasis on the view. It's a kind of quiet backdrop. And just as a kind of additional factor, the hearth and the kitchen worktops and the floors all contain a white marble. It's called Isle of Skye marble, which is actually quarried from this particular township. So it's like extremely local in that sense. So moving on to the second sort of emphasis is culture. And this is about the kind of cultural context. So the houses aren't just about being physically and aesthetically part of the landscape, but they are intended to be part of an architectural heritage, as I'd said before, kind of a renaissance in culture. So one of the ways that they do this is by bringing back existing buildings and ruins. So they might be barns like Cuddy Moss, or old farms that have become very disused, as in Moxon's project that's called Ardoch in the Cairngorms. The other way is by using materials common to the area and common to the existing vernacular, which is something that architects are talking about all over the world. But for example, the red tin of the previous project that we saw, or this aluminium at this project called Heast on the Isle of Skye. So to talk a bit more about this is designed by Mary Arnold Forster. It was completed in 2018. It was actually one of the first of these houses that I went to see, and what sort of eventually, I guess, gave me the idea to write a book about them. It's designed for a couple, one of whom is a non-practicing architect academic, and it is designed to be sort of typical of its surroundings and inspired by the Black House too. So this uses the tin that recalls the architecture of chapels, village halls, animal shelters and barns on the Isle of Skye. And then it's also about responding to an existing architectural heritage of the Black House. It is 1.5 stories and it is all in length, and it has this open room. That's the mezzanine bedroom, and it has this sort of, which is open to the main living space. So these projects engage with a kind of renaissance of cultural associations that are sort of both high and low, if you like. This is sort of at the other end of the scale. It's called 100 Acre Wood, and is another good example of how these projects are attempting to fit into a kind of cultural setting. It's designed by Denizen Works. It is enormous. It's a 7-bedroom home. It sits in a very prominent position up above Loch Orr in the mountainside. And I think it's like a sort of 8-year project. So in terms of the references that it's guided by, one of those was that it should be a kind of lady or gentleman in a tweed suit. But I mean, it has an abundance of references. So it's also a brutalist broch. It's inspired by Scottish tower houses, crofters' cottages, the castle which sits in Loch Orr, as well as Charles Rennie Mackintosh's homes. So it has a illusion of being shaped by the elements, but it also, from a landscape, that's kind of from a landscape perspective, continues its references within the use of materials. So the exterior is rendered using an aggregate that is made from 9,500 Scottish televisions, the glass from those. So it kind of sparkles, even though it's also very kind of tough looking. But this is a kind of stormy grey appearance that is very common in sort of rough cast harling. There's a type of rough cast harling, essentially, that's common in buildings throughout Scotland, as I'm sure you kind of, in the architecture of Scotland that you have a picture of, that probably forms quite a big part of it. So it's used on this enormous sort of fortified house, if you like. So the third area that brings these projects together is construction, which as an architecture journalist is something that maybe sounds slightly odd, but the serenities that emerge out of these projects and why clients want to be there disguise the architectural and building processes and the kind of wildness and chaotic nature often of their construction. So generally, the more tranquil the setting, the more challenging and complicated the building work. And these conditions have a direct impact on the design of these houses. So contractors and architects must work out how to design and build these homes, often with minimal resources and equipment. So that's maybe another area that's kind of quite interesting to hear. So in terms of access, it can be extremely limited. So many of the sites are accessible by only mud track, or they can be sort of miles from the nearest hard road. They can be up steep inclines. They can, and these may not be passable depending on the time of year and the weather conditions. And quite often they rely on builders manually manoeuvring materials and equipment in trailers attached to the back of their 4x4s. And because they're just simply routes that bigger vehicles can't access. They are also maybe limited by environmental protections for the landscape and for wildness. So they're houses that are often in areas of outstanding natural beauty, for example, sites of special scientific interest, perhaps, and they have certain sort of planning conditions that must be met. They're also challenging climatic conditions. So these projects are about being in majestic and epic locations. That's why people want them. They are on private islands, they're by the coast, they're by lochs, they're on the top of mountains, the side of mountains. And with those conditions come exposure to Scotland's formidable weather. So they are by design often alone, and by consequence makes them even more exposed. And this all adds to the challenge of construction, with sites having to be closed, for example, for portions of the year. So, for example, in the case of Brown and Brown's Spy on Cop, it was closed during its construction, which took about 4 years, I think, even though it's a very small house, for 3 months of each year. Then they are also far from population centres. And what that means is there is like an additional imperative for designing locally. So it's not just a kind of contextual desire, but it's also a practical one. And getting materials to these sites can be costly and difficult. For example, in the project on the cover, it meant that Isaac Arundel wanted to use materials that are available locally or via their local builders merchants. So it's almost designed as simply as possible. And this also has an impact on personnel. It's really hard to find suitable contractors for these projects. And the more remote these projects are, like this one, the contractors must operate fairly extreme practices. So this is Tai Na Coal, which is designed by WT Architecture. It is in Sutherland. It is probably 2 hours drive from the nearest substantial place. And it's a compact second home for a client whose family have been on the site for a couple of generations and who have a background in the woodland. And it is one of these sites of special scientific interest. So in terms of the construction, it was forbidden from having any wet trades on site. So the project is built on stilts, and all of the interior wall linings, as you can see here, are oak veneered panels because they couldn't have any kind of plaster or anything with a wet trade. In terms of other construction challenges, it is so remote that the contractor had to operate a 2-week on, 2-week off schedule in order for the workers not to be away from their families for really long periods, because they are having to stay on or near the site rather than commuting, I suppose. And so this is also Lochside House, which we saw before, designed by Haysom Ward Miller. It's a 3-bedroom home, and it has sort of typical features like the Scottish larch cladding. This is the one whose pitched roofs relate to the mountain behind. In terms of its construction, it uses, this stone is from the site's own quarry, so it's very local. And then the green roof is planted with species from the foreshore. And there are a number of factors here that have a direct impact on its design and the approaches used. So it's 2 miles from the nearest hard surface road. It is detached from utilities and all services. And this is quite a good example of a project that experienced particularly wild weather conditions and shows what contractors and architects are up against when it comes to this in these sites. So during one particular storm, the caravan that the foreman was living in on the site had its roof light blown out. The site toilet ended up, which had been weighed by 150 kilograms of cement, ended up flown onto the beach, and the scaffolding moved several inches. That's just in one storm. So this contractor talked about applying the same logic to building as sailing, so that you would have one hand for the ship and one for yourself. So when you're building, hold on with one hand and work with the other. The footprint also is adapted to the site in terms of weather conditions. So it looks south across the sheltered bay of the peninsula rather than looking out onto the loch. And this block of woodland behind to the north shelters the house from weather coming in from the loch. And then the northern band of accommodation, I'm not quite sure whether you can sit, it's actually that's the start of it down at the bottom picture, is like the services. So it has the generator room, a yard, a sort of plant room, utility room, bathroom, is the sort of services which act as an additional buffer to this kind of the Scottish weather, I suppose. And that's a tactic that quite a few of the houses employ. So in other ways, it's also completely off-grid and is interesting in its own way for that, which draws us to the last of these sort of themes, which is sustainability. So many of the projects in the book offer solutions to the climate crisis through their superior thermal performance, their use of natural materials, passive designs, and integrated renewable technologies and low carbon design, both in sort of operational energy and embodied carbon. So yeah, the previous house was off-grid, and the architects involved in this work are also very aware of their role in combating the climate, carbon-heavy design, and designing homes in precious landscapes, essentially. So they some of them consider themselves at the coalface of a changing climate too. So they do integrate sort of multiple sustainable technologies and materials. So this on the left is Ostro, which is in Stirlingshire. It's designed by Paper Igloo, and it is a passive house design that was self-built by them, and they have optimized everything for energy and thermal efficiency. So it is constructed from almost all natural materials. There is some membranes in the green roof, and it is also demountable. Every element is reusable, recyclable, or compostable. It is a cube, almost a perfect cube, I think, to maximize volume, but minimize surface area, which is all about heat loss. And its services are all contained within this black central core, and that's designed to shorten piping and ducting distances. It met the REBA 2030 challenge, embodied carbon metric challenge, long before it was even invented. And that brings us on to our last case study, which is Island Retreat, which is a refurbishment of an existing 1980s house. That is the original footprint of the house, although this is the new version of it. And it is designed by McGinley Bell Architects. It is a complete overhaul of this existing building, and it's designed to be upgraded in terms of making it more comfortable and habitable. So previously, it was fairly rudimentary. It had basically been self-built by one man, and it had no basic services, including drinking water. But yet it had been also what the architects thought had been carefully thought through in terms of its footprint in relation to its sort of climatic conditions, position on the island. It's on a small private island, so it's the only building on the island. It's also a project where construction had to be carefully considered, because access was on and off the island is via a sort of small jetty, so things had to arrive by small boat, which limits the sort of what you can take and the size of things you can take onto the island. There are no cars and no paved footpaths or roads, and at certain times of the year, if like it's been unused for a while, you have to actually beat your way back through the undergrowth to reach the house. So it's fairly extreme. And weather is obviously a major limitation in its own right, because if you have to cross the water, that's just dependent on the weather, whether that's possible at different times of year. So the whole point of the project was about like upgrading it, and that was through renewing the fabric of the building. So it's got a new insulated roof with a new membrane. It has new wall installation and linings. It's got new windows that are much more thermally efficient, a new solar array that you can see, which has a lead battery bank for power, heating and hot water. And then it has tanks for rainwater harvesting, and UV sterilizing system. And so that actually draws the presentation to a close. It's worth saying that we've largely focused on the sort of external design of these houses, but all these themes discussed within the presentation, like connecting with the landscape, culture, and construction processes, have a large impact on the design of the interiors too. And these are just a few of the examples. So on the top left there is Iram, which is designed by Bailey Bay, which is very, very young practice. And that's all Scottish Douglas fir for the interior. And they spent a long time sort of working out their structural components for that. So it uses local timber. Others use local aggregates, and they connect with views, etc. So, I mean, I hope what you've kind of got from this presentation is that these projects are really determined to connect with their landscape, their rural and remote landscapes in multiple ways, and provide a sort of enhanced relationship for experientially, but also in terms of architecturally with those landscapes, but also a cultural immersion into those landscapes and the communities that live there, and the construction approaches that are like intimately tied to geography and a responsibility towards the natural environment through enhanced performance and sustainable technologies by necessity, but also because it's sort of by responsibility. All of these projects are in Scotland, as you know, and yet they're sort of rich, in my opinion, the engagement with the landscape and rural and remote contexts provide so many lessons in how you could apply similar approaches in similar settings, not necessarily the same ones, in contexts all over the world, and in places like Jersey, as we kind of you're kind of working through this kind of Jersey identity, and it seems ever more important to do so in relation to people searching for kind of retreat and quieter but still connected lives. And so this is why it's been such a sort of experience to write this book, and why I think it's an important record now for architecture just in the UK generally, and sort of as an architectural community to sort of know and understand them. So I'd just like to open to the floor, whether you have any questions, you can let me know. But also in the meanwhile, the Reba Publishing is also delighted to offer a 20% discount if you would like to if you would like to buy the book, and if you would like to sort of jot down that sort of code that you would put in at rebabooks.com, you could get a 20% discount. Otherwise, I'd like to open it up to the floor to ask whether you have any questions about the book, or also just about the projects that I may be able to answer if you have really specific questions. And I don't know. Thank you. Just for that audience, yeah.
Well, anybody to open? Here we go.
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned that the houses had a lot of focus on community and culture.
Yeah.
Did you by any chance have any conversations with the communities to see what they thought of the projects and how they have received it?
I mean, I think that it has been something that's changed over time. I know that still certain projects have come up with a lot of resistance, certainly at a kind of planning stage. So, for example, Torrin, which was designed by Dulcas and completed last year, that had to go to planning appeal, I think, because the community disapproved of it so much, because in certain circumstances, culturally, the local community still doesn't necessarily want contemporary architecture in what it understands before it's built. But I think how that house has been received in practice has been very different from what they thought prior to it being built. However, I think from a kind of planning perspective, these projects have gained a real momentum, and they are seen as assets to the landscape. They are seen as like not just because of their kind of architectural value, but also because they are bringing whole new types of people to that landscape. Some of them are ones that you can go on holiday and stay in, for example, and they contribute to a kind of growing sense of sort of rural Scotland and potentially tourism, countering depopulation, and they are ways that sort of say the Highland Council is generally very responsive to these designs, essentially.
Hi, sorry, yeah, thanks. Great talk. It was really interesting. I loved the bit at the beginning about the macro, the way you pulled out and looked at it as a whole.
Yeah.
And sort of looked at the kind of almost the currents that they were swimming in without almost knowing it. I sort of find that fascinating, these sort of things that are affecting architecture and its style and shape without, I guess, one being aware necessarily, but it sort of makes sense. And I wondered if there's any other thoughts you had about that, about why people were driven to a bit more on that. I don't know, it's a sort of, I remember when these projects were sort of starting, it all sort of felt like it made sense to me when they kind of appeared in publications. I think of other practices like mole and stuff in England, and I'm not sure my question is, maybe what one thought was, have you thought of taking that way of looking at Scotland and tried applying it anywhere else in the UK to understand their sort of currents that are, I feel like there's a kind of framework for analysing something and seeing it for what it is.
Yeah, well, yes, people have asked me that about whether you could apply this sort of movement that's happened to other parts of the UK. But I think what's important, and I didn't really talk about here, is that this is coming from like a very small community of architects originally, so it was just a handful of people. And the practices that are coming out, the practices that are operating now, of which there are a lot really, they are somehow all sort of connected and have disseminated from those practices. So for example, Anne Nisbet, she worked for Dulcas, she set up or helped set up their Glasgow office. She's actually from the West Coast herself. And then Mary Arnold Forster is another one of these. And then Isat Arundel, so Ailey, she worked for WT Architecture. So they're all sort of connected in various ways, which I think is quite unique to this particular type of work and actually rural Scotland. And I think, so Brown and Brown is also one of these, and they've kind of spun out across from sort of west to east and south. So I think it's a little bit difficult to replicate, certainly in England, for example. But in terms of interesting rural houses that are becoming a sort of movement, I know that rural Northern Ireland also has this at the same time, well, coming now, I suppose, that there are more and more practices that are working on private homes of a similar nature that are about being embedded in the landscape there. And there are sort of a handful of practices that are working on those types of projects and really determined to find a new balance for rural homes. So does that answer your question?
I think so. It's just fascinating to think that it's like a little community of people.
Yeah.
I guess it's like, like Frank Lloyd Wright worked in Sullivan's studio, and it's like they all kind of like you realise it's actually just a few individuals, I suppose. That's also really interesting as a counterpoint to your macro point.
Yeah, so I think that is what's interesting about this work as well, is that it wasn't top down in any way. It was really generated from people doing things themselves, building their own homes and taking risks on their own. And actually quite a few of these houses are the houses that, or even the ones that could have been in the book that aren't, are the houses that architects have designed for themselves, and they have often built them with their own hands. So Tin House was one of those. That's actually their kind of holiday let that's next to their home, wooden house, and that was self-built. The project by Bailey that I show briefly at the end, the interior with the Douglas fir, that is also self-built by them for themselves, and that is part of experimenting with these ideas, that these are architects that don't just design houses for these landscapes but want to be embedded in them themselves, and they are moving from, say, Edinburgh and Glasgow to these rural areas and setting up practices there. So the project on the cover is another one of those. So that's an architecture practice that self-built that project, and they have gone to live on Harris and work from Harris, and they island hop to their projects, and there are more and more of these projects that makes that possible in order to sustain. I would say, sort of 24 practices like that on this work alone. So it's a really sort of strong community. But what's actually interesting about this book is that even though some of them have come from working in these practices, they don't necessarily meet up very often because they are geographically very spread out. So they're kind of pleased by this book because it really brings them together, and they haven't had that opportunity before.
Thank you for the talk. It's really inspiring. I suppose I'm starting to think about what we can learn from this when it comes down to our context.
Yep.
It's clear that those buildings just evolved out of the landscape. And more we need to be doing that here in Jersey. More and more you start to see how the local architects have inspired that new form of vernacular and how that's just grown. Mm-hmm. And so with that, we just need to take that with courage to take that forward, the local architects moving forward from that. Were those local architects there in Scotland always encouraged and taken forward in this courageous way?
What was your question?
So the Scottish architects that designed some of these quite rurally,
Yeah.
I mean, were they encouraged by the local politicians, the local communities? It sounds like they weren't, but they just need to move forward and just grab hold of the opportunities and go for it. And they've only just celebrated afterwards, because we don't always feel like we're being supported in the same way over here, when a lot of UK architects have been asked to come over to do the work instead of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think definitely initially they met resistance, as I kind of said in an architectural sense, that they, weren't really encouraged to design timber houses, and they had to paint them white, and they had to be a certain size and scale and style. But over time, they have pushed that that objective to change them, or to operate within those limitations and produce things that are potentially very contemporary. I think that now they are much more actively encouraged by the planning authorities, and some of them, like the ones in the Cairngorms, for example, are in national park, and yet the national park supports them. So I think what I said sort of briefly at the beginning is like how quickly an architectural culture can change if the architecture proves its worth to some extent. And I think these have done that, and while there is some disquiet at times about from local people. Perhaps they have generated a whole economy and a whole lot of new people who want to go and live in those areas, which is what these planning authorities also think is good for their locations wherever they are in rural Scotland. Yeah.
Good evening, thank you. Question really on process. I guess the day job for you is deadlines. You know, you've got to get a magazine out every month or whatever it might be. How does your process, or did your process change at all in writing, having, it's not an endless deadline perhaps, but a different kind of scenario where you could explore things differently, perhaps be more you and less the magazine? How did that, as a writer, impact the way you approach things?
Yeah, that's interesting. No one really asks about the process of the book, so it's good to know. Good to have a question occasionally.
We're all about process here, aren't we?
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
Yeah.
So unusually, I guess how I'd begin to answer that is that usually when you write an architecture book, and I didn't realise this before I started writing one, you don't visit the buildings that are going to be in the book. And I guess that is where my approach from journalism changes what I did for this book, because for me that's just not possible. If I'm writing a book about this, I want to go and see the houses that are in it, or about anything really, because that's what I would do for the Reba Journal. And not all architecture magazines do that either, but that's what we do. And the desire to write the book is as much for my own interest as well as and to my own sort of sense of interest, I suppose, just to go and explore these things. I mean, that's partly why I'm an architecture journalist, because I get to see lots of projects, and so that was the starting point in terms of how I went about it. So, I mean, I went to visit a lot of them. Some of them I'd seen before. I didn't quite get to all of them. I think I went to about 18 on one particular trip. But yeah, I had seen some of them before. So I didn't get to see the one that was most northerly, because I did see the WT architecture one, it's very north. It's in Scowrie in Sutherland. But there's one that's slightly further north, but that's a 3-hour drive even from there. And on the map, it doesn't look like 3 hours. So the distances between them is vast. So in terms of what I wanted to write in it, I mean, when I write it for the magazine, generally we have quite a similar approach in that there isn't necessarily that much space to include lots of buildings that we don't like. So we just don't cover buildings that we don't like. And so then this is obviously a book where I got to choose all the projects, so I like all of them. So that's the difference to some extent, that I knew I liked them, and so that produces like its own type of writing, I suppose. In other ways, I also wanted it's a book about architecture, but it's also about the landscape. So I wanted people to read the case studies and feel like they could be there. So that's the other kind of thing that I took to these particular pieces of writing, that maybe I wouldn't have to do so much in a book that was in a piece of writing that's just not only about that. So I wanted people who haven't necessarily been to Scotland to be able to feel like they might be in Scotland by reading it. So I hope that answers some of your question. Yeah.
I've got a quick question,
Yeah.
if I may. It's about constraints. And in your discussions with the architects, Isabelle,
Yeah.
clearly the beginnings of all of this came from, what was it, £40,000 and 70 square metres?
Yeah.
Impossible to get materials to site, being dictated on what materials to use. Yet somehow, some of the most creative outputs. And were they frustrated by it, or did it help them, do you think?
I mean, I think, maybe this is just a point generally, I think constraints are pretty useful for architecture, and they produce more creative results. And it's when maybe you've got kind of a blank canvas that you don't know quite how to respond. I mean, the last project that I talked about, which was Island Retreat, which is on its own private island, they thought, the architects, when I spoke to them, they thought that there wasn't very much to reference on their private island. So that's how they came up with this very dramatic painted facade with the black and white geometries. And that comes from a technique that was used on ships in the First World War mostly, and some in the Second World War, and it's called a dazzle effect. And that was a way of camouflaging ships in the horizon. And that's how they approached their particular kind of response to the site, that it's this sort of in-between site between the sea and the sky with a sort of slither of land. So I guess it just depends what people consider constraints, because for lots of the other architects included in this book and doing this work, that site wouldn't have presented that problem. They'd have found, references in the sort of perhaps the undergrowth from the site, or all manner of other things. So I think constraints generally are good, and I think that these are very constrained sites in terms of what you can do on them construction-wise, but also how quite often they don't want to impose on the landscape, and so that has a lot of restrictions, and that's about texture and colour and form, as we've kind of gone through really.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Time for one more.
Which is your favourite?
Oh, well, yeah, they're all my favourite, is the right answer. They have all been chosen for something that is unique about them. So, like, I want you to read each one and see the different approach that was there, and it doesn't relate to the next one. That's the kind of purpose, and so yeah, they're all brilliant, and yeah, hopefully you'll think that too. Really, do I have a real favourite? Well, Island Retreat is fun. The one in Sutherland is just kind of majestic, but it's also sort of quite quiet in the way that it sits in the landscape. It sits in this kind of like dip that's before the end of a peninsula where it attaches to the land. It's also I think it's the UK's most northerly oak forest, so it kind of references that. That's another favourite. There are a lot on the Isle of Skye that are good. There are a lot that aren't in the book that are also really interesting. And I don't know whether you've been to Skye, but if you go to Skye and you, just as a kind of visitor, you can see them in the landscape as you kind of go around. And that is also really exciting. That's how I first encountered them on Skye with that project Heast. And you could just see them scattered around. You'd be like, oh, that's designed by that architect, and oh, I can go and stay in that one. And it's kind of a really vibrant place architecturally as a result of these private homes.
Yeah, you can't have a favourite child, can you? But Isabelle, just wanted to say enormous thanks. Thanks for taking the trouble to come to Jersey.
It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic
Thank you.
talk, and yes, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much.